Now, normally I'm not the biggest fan of newer samurai films. It's kind of a personal preference I've noticed about myself whenever I watch a more recent film set in feudal Japan. I often get bored, largely due to perhaps a lack of interest in the story or characters, combined with weak musical accompaniment or subpar cinematography. So I've been pretty cautious about diving into many more recently released samurai films. Although one film that I continually see being mentioned in both the comment sections of my videos and on the Discord server is a film that came out in 2012 called The Floating Castle. A film I surprisingly really hadn't heard much of before, so I decided to finally check it out. Does it stack up to the hype? Well, let's dive in and find out. The Floating Castle was co-directed by Shinji Iguchi and Isshin Inuro. And while Iguchi appears to have had a pretty solid career so far working on larger scale, more famous films, Inuro is more well known for smaller scale productions. You can tell that by looking at both of their backgrounds, they came together to form a film that both tries to succeed on a grander scale as well as on a more personal level. The story centers around an event that I wasn't too knowledgeable on prior to watching this film and doing a little more background research. Like a lot of my other reviews, because this film is based on real history, I'm going to be diving into the plot a bit more. So with that said, there will be spoilers ahead if you have not seen this film or know the actual history. Now, the movie tells the interesting story of the siege of Oshi, a castle in Musashi province owned by the Narita clan. During Toyotomi Hideyoshi's war against the Hojo clan near the tail end of the 16th century, he decided to dispatch an army under one of his proteges, Ishida Mitsunari, along a route to seize various Hojo-aligned strongholds, while the main Toyotomi force laid siege to the Hojo capital at Odawara. This is all arranged on purpose so that Ishida Mitsunari can grow his reputation as a commander and bring more respect to his name, something that would desperately be needed for him in the years to come. And while the initial stages of his campaign fare well, he eventually comes upon Oshi Castle, where he is met with one of the toughest obstacles in his career. As Oshi is situated in a swampy terrain and thus is very hard to assault. In fact, it is because of its location that it is given the nickname, the Floating Castle. And while the story begins with Ishida Mitsunari and his relationship with other major samurai figures like Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Otani Yoshitsugu, the main focus of the film is actually on the defenders of Oshi. As it turns out, the main bulk of the Narita force is actually called away to aid the Hojo clan at Odawara, unfortunately only leaving a small garrison of around 500 soldiers and a portion of peasant militia behind to defend Oshi if it were to be attacked. Which obviously it does. The samurai in charge of defending it are a pretty ragtag group. Although initially they are going to surrender to Mitsunari's forces, eventually they decide to break rank and stand defiant in the face of overwhelming enemies. This causes Mitsunari to order a full attack, which surprisingly gets repelled. This then leads to the decision to attempt a flood attack, almost exactly similar to the one Toyotomi Hideyoshi used at Bichu Takamatsu in 1582. Yet still, the defenders actually managed to weather the flood attack, and even hold out until finally learning that Odawara had fallen and the war was to be over. Thus, Mitsunari failed to take the castle and grow his reputation, a setback that will no doubt come to haunt him in the years to come. As far as the plot goes, it's a pretty simple story that fits into a much larger historical context, and I actually really like that. It works for what it is. Although, I will say, it still felt like there was a genuine lack of climax towards the end. In a historical sense, it does follow pretty well to what actually happened. Thus, inserting a fake final battle would have hurt the film from a historical standpoint. Nonetheless, it still feels odd that the film sort of just ends, with no major climax in the third act. Perhaps the story could have been framed differently to make the flood attack the film's actual climax. Or maybe the writers could have drummed up some internal conflict within the Oshi defenders to create a more fitting climax. I don't know, I just know that for me, personally, it felt like it needed one last something at the end to tie it all together. Remember, this is a movie and needs to tell a compelling story to remain enjoyable. Even the most accurate historical films can sadly fall victim to being lackluster if the story isn't compelling. I'm looking at you, Dunkirk. But what about the characters? How do they fare? Honestly, I feel like more than anything else, it's the characters and the personal drama we get into that actually causes this film to work as well as it does. I like the interesting depictions we get of Ishida Mitsunari and Otani Yoshitsugu, although I will say I do wish Mitsunari came off a bit more angry at the end than he does, but that's a minor gripe. But more importantly, it is the defenders of Oshi who come together to truly carry the film. They are vivid and varied personalities, the things they value and the people they care about, and how they all respond to the bleak situation presented before them, all work together seamlessly. Although I will say that the film actually may have benefited from perhaps one or two less characters, and instead focused more on the figures that matter. In fact, that's one of the only problems I have at all with the characters, is that the story throws too many at us. I don't even remember most of the defenders' names, except for Nagachika, only because they keep yelling at him. Personally, I would have removed one of the samurai figures to instead focus more on the sister, Kaihime. Kaihime is an interesting character because she knows that for a fact when the castle falls, Toyotomi Hideyoshi wants her to be one of his concubines. A fate she definitely does not want. During the Edo period, the story of the defense of Oshi got fairly dramatized, and Kaihime in a lot of depictions got reimagined as a warrior, fighting to defend her home. And interestingly enough, that idea is not too far-reaching. In feudal Japan, there was the concept of the onabugeisha, female warriors belonging to the samurai class who would from time to time take up arms in defense of their family or home. Kaihime could have definitely filled that role, and I'm actually very surprised that the filmmakers decided to not take that route, especially as it would have made for an increased sense of tension, as now not only would she not want to be taken by the Toyotomi to be made a concubine, but now she is literally fighting with a spear in hand to stop that from happening. It would have gone to make the ending far more impactful as well, when the war ended and the defenders of Oshi negotiated with Mitsunari, in particular with Kaihime's fate on the line. Moving on, let's talk about editing and cinematography. Getting back into what I said at the beginning regarding my usual disinterest with more recently made samurai films, I feel a large part of that is because I have been spoiled. It's a hard shock going from classic Kurosawa to modern samurai films. Newer samurai films usually tend not to follow any stylistic approaches and in turn somewhat fall flat, at least for me. Whether they are too colorful, lacking interesting framing, or have a rough pacing. There is also as of late somewhat of a genuine lack of scale, especially when compared to the amazing scale of battles present in films such as Kagemusha, Ran, and even Heaven and Earth. But looking at what I just said in terms of the floating castle, luckily I think that this film actually succeeds in a number of the problem areas that its contemporaries tend to fail in. While its cinematography is something special, and its pacing works pretty good too, its sets and level of scale both surprisingly also work really well. Whether it be scenes of massive armies laying siege, thousands of torches lighting up the night, or the ruined field following the flood attack, this film still manages to capture a lot of great detail in a pretty stylistic manner. But unfortunately, even with that said, it's still not carried well by the music. This film's musical score is very much a disappointment, but is pretty on par with other modern samurai films. It just comes across a bit underwhelming, cliche, and even cheesy at parts. It's just kind of sad when samurai games like Nobunaga's Ambition can put forth a better soundtrack than an actual samurai film. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is the film's historical accuracy. For the most part, the plot of this film stays right on track with the actual historical events, and even at the end does a good job of telling the viewer what the future held for a lot of the characters in the film. Hell, even during the end credits, we are shown footage of what the site of the siege looks like today. You can really see that the people behind the making of the floating castle really did want to tell a story close to the actual history of what happened. Although it appears there are still some fairly minor inaccuracies. One thing that really stood out to me was the appearance of Otani Yoshitsugu. As you may know, Yoshitsugu eventually contracted leprosy, and it would plague him until his death at Sekigahara in 1600. Although there is a bit of speculation as to how and when he may have contracted leprosy, it is generally considered that by the late 1580s, he was already somewhat known as a leper and was showing signs of his body deteriorating, which is something this movie just ignores. So what it really comes down to for me is that since this film takes place in 1590, Yoshitsugu should already be showing some signs of leprosy. Another odd inaccuracy simply has to do with the flood attack. No, the waves would not roar in like this. If anything, it would have been a slow and steady tide that would have rolled in and continued to rise. Nothing this destructive. I know that the filmmakers wanted to make the flood attack appear more devastating, but this really ended up breaking a bit of immersion for me. On top of that, I have found no evidence that says that the dike ever broke, as the film suggests. Instead, it appears that the flood attack held until the surrender of Odawara finally came. That is not necessarily a big problem in my mind, however, as it doesn't really affect the overall course of events. Alright, so that is pretty much everything I usually like to go over in my film reviews. For a final rating on the film, given all that I just covered, I give The Floating Castle 3 stars out of 4. While it has some minor problems with its characters and history, I feel it's nothing serious or bad enough to subtract from the film overall, as The Floating Castle still manages to tell a good story rooted in history. Where the film does fall short in my opinion is in regards to its lack of a more impactful climax at the end, and its poor music coupled with its mixture of both average editing and good cinematography. In essence, I found The Floating Castle to be well worth the watch and a film that I would recommend. It's good, but in my opinion not necessarily great. Definitely a movie I would love to check out again to see if it gets any better with repeated viewings. But with that said, have you seen The Floating Castle? I know for a fact a lot of you seem to have. Let me know what you think about it in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most interesting.